Yeah, so my focus is on food and agriculture within the context of climate change and on a meta level, looking at a global multi-trillion-dollar industry that has created some very challenging conditions. So let me share my screen here and get into the slideshow here. So to explain the challenge that we're facing here, let's take a look, first of all, at the IPCC report from 2018. At that time, there was an assumption that we would start drastically reduce fossil fuel-based emissions, and we would have cut the total output in half by 2030. Then by 2040 to 2055, we would essentially achieve a net zero scenario. Obviously, this bend here hasn't happened yet. So we are in 2022, we're supposed to be significantly down already, and we are supposed to be on a downward trajectory. Just to put that into perspective, my granddaughter turns 12 in 2030. So let's take another look here at a statistic, the carbon budget. So the carbon budget is a composition of basically all of the climate models around the globe. And these scientists estimated somewhere in the middle of these studies, remaining 193 billion tons of carbon in 2018. That same year, global emissions amounted to 37 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. So you can tell we are already at some critical tipping points. Another statistic to take in is that we are using 1.8 times the reproductive capacity of the planet. The way to explain that is that nearly 90% of global fish stocks are either fully fished out, the stocks have collapsed, or they're being overfished, moving towards a collapse. Everybody has heard about aquifers being pumped dry beyond their replenishment rates, whether that's in the United States or in India or in China or anywhere you go. And then Earth has lost about 1/3 of its arable land in the past 40 years. So what that means, basically, looking at a population today of 8 billion people moving to 8.6 by 2030 and then wherever by 2050, we are depleting the ecological capital. We are drawing down ecological capital while we are at the same time increasing the demand on it. So another data point here in the food system, there is an incredibly dangerous concentration of crops because of the industrialization of the agricultural system. Bigger is better, make it deal with one farmer instead of 50. So it's good for economics, but from a food safety perspective, this is incredibly fragile. I mean, you look at California, for example, which is now flat out of water. The Colorado River is severely depleted, aquifers empty. And then you look at all the products coming out of that state, you can see that is risk, but the same levels of concentration also apply to potatoes, wheat, corn, you name it. So that is indicating, that from a food security perspective, the system should be decentralized. So let's take a look at what are basically our options. So bad news, where are we going? What are the options going forward? So there are basically two main levers that we can pull. One is energy, well understood, what to do here. The other one is photosynthesis, which is now moving into focus, which is now beginning to really be understood, for its amazingly important function. So I have a video here, which can explain what I would have to say in about 3.5 minutes. So let's take a look at that.
Soils for food security and climate. Human activities release enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, CO2, into the atmosphere. This intensifies the greenhouse effect and accelerates climate change. Every year, plants recover 30% of CO2 thanks to their process of photosynthesis. Later, when plants die and decompose, living organisms in the soil, such as bacteria, fungi, and earthworms, transform them into organic matter. This carbon-rich organic matter is essential for human food because it holds water, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which are essential to the growth of plants. The world's soil contains 2 to 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere. Increasing this storage of carbon by 0.4% per year, or 4 parts per thousand, in the top 30 or 40 centimeters of the soil could stop the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the proposal of the 4 parts per thousand Soils for Food Security and the Climate Initiative. The increase in carbon storage in soils would therefore contribute not only to stabilizing the climate, but also to ensuring food security, that is, the supply of sufficient food for all people. How can it be carried out? Policy measures must be established to reduce deforestation and encourage ecological farming practices that boost the amount of organic matter in soils and meet the 4 parts per thousand every year objective. Examples would be: avoid leaving the soil bare so as to limit carbon loss. Restore crops, pastures, and degraded forests. Plant trees and legumes that have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen in the soil. Use manure and composts to nourish the soil, or allow water to collect at the base of plants. Who is targeted? There are 570 million farms in the world and more than 3 billion people living in rural areas that could implement these practices. At what cost? To restore agricultural soils, it would cost a few $dozen per hectare. However, agroforestry and the renewal of forests would require more investments. And for how long? The sequestration of carbon in soil would continue for 20 to 30 years after the good farming practices are put in place, provided these practices are maintained. Under the 4 parts per thousand initiative, researchers are coming together with farmers, associations, economic stakeholders, regions, and countries for the purpose of food security and climate.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm jumping too fast here. So the key word here is regenerative agriculture, and it's a term that I became aware of a few years back. It's fairly new, but it defines management practices that restore the soil. So we're beyond sustainable, right? 10, 20 years ago, we would talk about shifting into sustainable practices. It's too late for that. With the soil being so depleted, its watersheds polluted, we have to regenerate, we have to repair. So that's the meaning of that term here. So what does it all mean? I mean, lots of bad news here, and no need to really have to get too deep into these technical aspects other than to understand, we have to get our soil and our watersheds back to life. So what does that mean? It is, first of all, it has to be demand-driven. It has to engage the population, because regeneration depends on local types and conditions of soil, local climate, even microclimates, water availability, and then the socioeconomic realities within the community. The industrial food system as it is conceived today cannot reform itself without the active participation by an informed public. They need to see demand in order to change their production and their supply chain policies and so on and so on. They need to see that the market is moving into a direction that forces them to adapt and adjust, and also incentivizes them to adapt and adjust. And any such change has to be built from the ground on up at community level, because nature is local. Every community is dealing with different realities in their immediate environment. And changing crop cycles and types of crops, which is part of the regenerative agricultural idea, requires a corresponding change in menus and dietary habits. So the farmer can't change a crop that may be very conducive for their particular type of soil, but there needs to be a market available to sell into this. And that market also requires for the people to maybe change their menus, change their dietary preferences. So it's a whole systems change out that's required here, or adaptation. Here is something that I wanted to bring attention to. It's hosted by the Harvard School of Public Health in partnership with the Culinary Institute of America. What they're basically doing is to replicate the inherent intelligence embedded in ancient cuisines from around the world. So you go to the Mediterranean, whether that's German, or you go to like German, France, Italy, you go to Japan, China, Vietnam. These are cultures that have lived on their land for thousands of years without destroying their soil. And the way that came about is because there's a complementary cycle between their menus, the foods they eat, and what nature can produce sustainably, over many, many generations. In the United States, we have lost that connection. So this is essentially turning the strategic direction of the food industry upside down. So where traditionally, and I was in the middle of that, we would design menus that are as standardized as can be and replicable as can be, and then issue instructions, so to speak, to the supply chain to say, I want this type of crop grown in this kind of style. Now we're turning this thing upside down, where we're saying, what can I source locally from regenerative farmers that supports them in regenerating their soil, and what can I do with these products to make them exciting, to put them to create nutritionally sound, tasty menus. So what Harvard and the CIA are doing is training chefs to basically go into a region and then look around to see what is available here, and develop a reciprocal relationship with farmers, with the food processors, to develop a local style cuisine that is harmonized with the needs of the surrounding ecology. So that is a very exciting initiative here. When you think about cuisines from India, from Italy, I mean, these are exciting foods. France, I mean, so advanced. So we can replace these fast food restaurants that we have become so reliant on with local foods that are fresh, that are nutritious, and nutrient rich. So then another perspective here is the agriculture of the middle, farmers that are too big for the local farmers market and consumer-supported agriculture, but too small to participate in this contract farming that the industry has initiated and is reliant on. So they deal with farmers that have thousands of acres of land. And so these guys with 80, 100, maybe 300-400 acres are being left out. I mean, even a 1,000-acre farm today is not big enough to participate in some crop types. But by focusing on these farmers and assisting them, in changing their practices, if they shift into a multi-crop process with integrated livestock, that is the most efficient form of farming to produce high-quality nutrient-rich calories. And on a calorie per acre basis, that is the most efficient form of farming. So again, it requires an assessment inside the community to take a look at, what do we have, and where could we be going if we join forces and engage a community level adaptation in our food system. There are corporate commitments from Kroger, Walmart, Albertson, and others, and that has not yet worked out in the way that we would all hope. But with the shift in community interest, in engaged populations, wanting to see this shift happen, these companies here are key to a successful transition. So that's basically where I wanted to take us. Sorry, there's a lot of information, dense and compacted here, but the key message really is we have damaged the ecosystem and the around us. We have damaged soil and watersheds to the point where it's getting us into some real trouble. And to change that now requires a whole systems approach, and we need to, starting with an educated consumer who insists on sharing the efforts to make this all work. So hopefully we can stimulate a conversation coming out of this.